tonight from Baghdad. With the shooting war here hopefully winding down, the U.S. is hopeful on the terror front and officially lowers alert levels. Former POWs start their journey home. We'll give you new details tonight of their dramatic rescue. Abu Abbas was just the beginning. U.S. forces are on the hunt now for a long list of fugitive terrorists in Iraq. And with Abbas in custody, relatives of his victims fear they still might not get justice.
This is the CBS Evening News, with Dan Rather reporting tonight from Baghdad.
Good evening. As America heads tonight into the 5th week of war, the U.S. military is shifting into the next phase. The Pentagon said today U.S. commanders may soon move their operational headquarters from Kuwait to here in Iraq. Ahead of that move, the top U.S. field commander, General Tommy Franks, made his first visit to Baghdad since the war began. The Pentagon also offered its first accounting of the cost of the war, $20 billion so far, and another $2 billion a month as long as the occupation lasts. As more scattered fighting showed today, there's also an ongoing cost in lives, both American and Iraqi. In the United States, CBS's Bob Orr reports the official, quote, terror alert level, raised to orange before the war started, was lowered today back to yellow.
Intelligence intercepts are picking up less chatter about possible plots against American interests here and abroad. Fears of retaliatory attacks by Iraqi sympathizers have not materialized. And U.S. officials say al-Qaeda has been so decimated, the terrorist organization may no longer be capable of a large-scale attack like 9/11. Remaining al-Qaeda operatives, sources say, are being forced by tighter security to search for new ways to attempt to enter the U.S. The threat level was hiked to orange 2 days before the war began. Captured al-Qaeda mastermind Khalid Sheikh Mohammed warned terrorists had planned attacks to coincide with the U.S. invasion. Officials say it's not known if increased police patrols in subways and tighter controls around landmarks and nuclear power plants prevented any attacks. But suspicious people have been detained. One Iranian traveling on an Australian passport was turned away at the New York-Canadian border. Another man was arrested near Laredo, Texas, in a failed plot to transport Iraqi nationals across the Mexican border. While New York City, a known terrorist target, will remain at a higher level of alert, some of the most visible security will be reduced across the rest of the country. For cash-strapped cities and states, it's a budgetary relief. A month at Code Orange has cost them an estimated $2 billion, largely in overtime for security forces. But terrorism experts warn we can't afford to be complacent.
There will be more attacks on the American homeland. It may not be next week, it may not be next month, it may not be next year, but there will be attacks in the future.
There's no question at some point the terror threat level will once again be raised from yellow back up to orange. While the terror color codes are often ridiculed, federal officials say they do help to keep people focused on a continuing threat. Bob Orr, CBS News, Washington.
U.S. Marines reported today they found a recently abandoned terrorist training camp on the outskirts of Baghdad. And as Jim Stewart reports, the hunt is on everywhere in Iraq for more terrorist leaders like the one caught here Monday, Abu Abbas.
He's older and fatter now, and he never fought in the trenches with Iraqi soldiers like he promised. So when U.S. forces raided Abu Abbas's Baghdad apartment, the retired terrorist went quietly and looters took care of the rest. The question now is what to do with him. Abbas is the admitted mastermind of the hijacking of the Italian cruise ship Achille Lauro in 1985, but has always insisted that the murder of passenger Leon Klinghoffer, an American tourist, wasn't his fault.
Mistake. And this mistake follow another mistakes.
Saddam Hussein gave Abbas sanctuary. The Italians have sentenced him to life in prison, and today the Palestinian Liberation Organization called for his release. But the U.S. says it's studying its own murder charges and is not about to release him.
Abu Abbas is a terrorist. He was a terrorist, he remains a terrorist, and he will be viewed as such.
Meanwhile, U.S. forces have more names on their terrorist shopping list now that Baghdad has fallen. Next up may be Abdul Yassin, accused of helping make the bomb in the first World Trade Center attack in 1993. Yassin also fled to Baghdad, but was greeted with suspicion and put in jail. He even showed reporters the scars he got while mixing the bomb. Most intriguing is this man, Ahmed Khalil al-Ani, who worked here in the now ransacked headquarters of Iraqi intelligence. But he was once stationed here in Prague. And there are conflicting reports about whether he secretly met 9/11 hijacker ringleader Mohammed Atta there in April 2001. If so, what did they discuss? Also missing is Abu Zakawi, an al-Qaeda lieutenant who lost a leg fighting in Afghanistan and got treatment in Baghdad. And there's Farouk Hijazi, an Iraqi ambassador tied to a 1993 assassination attempt against former President George Bush. Hijazi may have escaped to Syria by now. Some of these men may have suspected a day of reckoning would come. Abu Abbas, for one, told a visiting American journalist last year that after thinking it over, he decided that killing civilians is wrong. Dan?
And later in this broadcast, to talk with the daughters of Leon Klinghoffer and what they think should be done with Abu Abbas. Though the worst of the battlefield combat is now over, U.S. forces are still coming under fire. There were skirmishes in the town of Tikrit and at an airbase north of Baghdad, and at least 3 Iraqis were killed and several wounded in a street fight with U.S. troops in Mosul. But the main job now for U.S. forces here is trying to reestablish order and rebuild infrastructure. The man in charge of it is Army Major General Buford Blunt, who told me his first concern is still protection of his troops.
Well, any transition can be dangerous. What we can't lose sight of is that there is still a fight here with the terrorists, with the Fedayeen. They've imported some people from other countries here that want to kill Americans, want to kill U.S. soldiers.
Are we or are we not likely to see a classic guerrilla campaign against your forces and the other American forces here?
I don't believe so. The Iraqi people are really stepping forward, and they're not going to stand for that. The Iraqi people want their freedom. They want the old regime gone, and I think they're stepping forward to take part in helping us ensure that that happens.
Still, the U.S. military has taken on an enormous job in trying to get Iraq up and running again. And men trained to be riflemen don't easily become repairmen.
We're not plumbers and electricians, we're a combat unit.
These infantrymen, exhausted from the long wait in the Kuwaiti desert and the fighting march up through Iraq, are still ready to take on the general's orders.
Most of our focus is on war fighting, going out and getting the bad guys, but just seeing the response on these people's face, when we, help them get medical supplies, help them get food and water. I mean, a lot of ways that's what we're here for.
Among the most critical places to get up and running are Iraq's hospitals. General Blunt personally delivered food and supplies to the Katamiya Medical Center, where he sat down to talk to the doctors there.
We're going to have the power back on in the city soon.
He may have gotten more than he bargained for.
There are lots of unexploded cluster bombs. Children, they're just playing around with them and they just blow up. There are missiles, massive missiles, in neighborhoods. I think these should be your priority.
Okay, and I understand.
A colonel stepped in to take the doctor's questions, but this general remains convinced that his soldiers have made good progress.
If you look at what has happened, where we were 8 days ago, I know everybody wants it done now, but the progress that's happening here is phenomenal.
The 4-week battlefield victory here in Iraq was an impressive success for the U.S. military. But as CBS News correspondent Richard Roth reports tonight from a U.S. airbase in Germany, one of the most dramatic successes of the war, the rescue of 7 American POWs, very nearly failed.
Halfway home from the war zone, the 7 former POWs came to Ramstein tonight for what military officials called the final stage of repatriation. After a rescue last weekend, it now turns out that almost didn't happen. First accounts sounded matter of fact, a clockwork raid on a house north of Baghdad, and a quick rescue of the American prisoners, all safe and reasonably sound. Now history's first draft has been revised by Marines telling of the fear they felt. Tracking down a house they'd been tipped off was number 13, but unluckily couldn't find. Washington Post reporter Peter Baker has been embedded with the Marines unit.
As they were searching up and down these alleys and dusty passageways, they suddenly noticed more and more Iraqis appearing on the streets and on the rooftops above them. And they began to get worried. They thought, well, maybe this was another Black Hawk Down situation.
On edge and under sniper fire, Marines worried they were being set up for ambush. The commander was about to pull them back when a man peered from a window and quietly called out, "I'm an American." That was Chief Warrant Officer David Williams in dirty yellow pajamas, the senior officer among the POWs. "Don't harm the guards," he told Marines as they stormed the house. The prisoners' final set of captors had been ordinary Iraqi policemen and kind. But out of bondage, the POWs quickly bonded with their rescuers.
I love you, Marines! I love you, Marines!
Safe at a U.S. medical camp that first night, one of the freed prisoners pleaded with the Marines to stay, and so they did. The heroes in this aren't the POWs who spent 3 weeks in captivity and fear, one of them now insists, but the Marines who set them free. Richard Roth, CBS News, Ramstein Air Base, Germany.
Coming up on the CBS Evening News. The Klinghoffer daughters demand American justice for the terrorists nabbed here in Iraq so many years after the murder of their father. Lisa Klinghoffer was 34 years old. Her sister Ilsa was 28 when their father Leon was murdered by the terrorist organization allegedly run by Abu Abbas. Now that Abbas is in custody, what do Klinghoffer's daughters think should happen to him? CBS's Jane Clayson talked to them in New York City today.
Leon and Marilyn Klinghoffer were celebrating their anniversary when their cruise ship was taken over by terrorists.
My sister kept saying, "It's the boat, it's the boat." I said, "Well, what about the boat?" And she said, "The boat's been hijacked." And it's those 3 words that just changed our whole lives.
Leon was shot and thrown overboard in his wheelchair. His daughters, Lisa and Ilsa, have spent 18 years trying to bring Abu Abbas to justice. Last night, a friend broke the news.
They got him. They said they got him.
And initially you said?
I said, "Bin Laden?" She said, "No, not Bin Laden." I said, Saddam? No, not Saddam. Abbas. I was stunned. For a second, I was truly stunned.
Have you ever wanted to see Abu Abbas? Have you ever wanted to talk to him?
When my mother had to identify the 4 other terrorists in Italy, she went to the jail and she spit on each one of them without saying a word, because there's really nothing to say. And I think I look forward to the day that I can do that on her behalf.
My father's murder really put a face on terrorism. Our family were real people who all of a sudden got engulfed in the world of terrorism. And I think from that moment on, this abstract idea of terrorism became more real.
So what do you want now? What do you want to have happen to Abu Abbas now?
I want him to be brought here, tried here, and served a life sentence of misery here. He killed an American. We want to be the ones to give him his justice.
But it's not just to avenge their father. They say there's a larger issue, that bringing Abbas to justice now sends a message to terrorists everywhere. Increasingly, there's no place to run, no place to hide. Jane Clayson, CBS News, New York.
According to the Defense Department, there are now 132 Americans and 30 British confirmed killed in action during the war. There are no longer any Americans known to be held prisoner, but 3 Americans are listed as missing. That's the news from this tumultuous and still dangerous part of the world. Dan Rather reporting tonight from Baghdad. The CBS Evening News continues now with Harry Smith in New York. Harry?
Thanks, Dan. Back from the war smiles were all out today in southern New Mexico. The celebration was at Holloman Air Force Base, home of the F-117 stealth fighters of the 49th Fighter Wing. F-117 pilots delivered many precision-guided weapons during the air campaign in Iraq. Today, their families got to deliver homecoming hugs. Coming up next on the CBS Evening News, can it get even worse for the troubled airline industry? Stand by. We're about to find out.
The SARS epidemic. A quarantine didn't stop the disease in a major North American city, so now what? Also, Dan Rather reports from Baghdad tomorrow on the CBS Evening News.
On the CBS Market Watch, the government says consumer prices rose a mild 0.3% in March, but for the year so far, inflation is running more than 5%. That's twice last year's rate and largely the result of higher energy prices. Wall Street today, stocks closed mixed. The Dow lost 144 points, and the Nasdaq was up just under 4. The struggling U.S. airline industry has been losing a fortune. American Airlines has been teetering on the brink of bankruptcy for weeks. There's a major development tonight in that story, and CBS News business correspondent Anthony Mason is here with that.
Harry, flight attendants for American Airlines have reversed themselves today and approved a pay cut, tossing the company a lifeline. American, the world's largest airline, is seeking $1.8 billion in wage concessions from its employees to try to stave off bankruptcy.
Many of American's 24,000 flight attendants did not like the idea of taking a cut in pay.
I don't want them to go under, but you know, that's not my fault. I didn't make them go under.
But the entire airline industry has been hemorrhaging money, wounded by war, SARS, and a weak economy. More than 100,000 industry employees have been laid off since 9/11. Then came the war in Iraq. Traffic over the Atlantic last week was down 21% from a year ago. Now the SARS virus is frightening passengers in the Pacific region, where air traffic fell more than 35% last week. A recent study by Standard & Poor's found
that the U.S. airline industry is in probably the worst shape it's ever been in.
Jim Corridor, the survey's author, forecast that the top 10 carriers in the U.S. were on a course to lose $6.5 billion this year. And that was before the war. Now it could be more than $10 billion. The sweeping cost cuts by all the major carriers will help.
But given that we are seeing the worst environment in aviation history, I don't think that the cuts are going to necessarily be enough to save all the companies that are currently competing in the industry right now.
In other words, expect more bankruptcies. Some carriers could even be forced to liquidate. And don't expect a quick recovery. After the last Gulf War, it took 2 years for business to take off again. Harry?
Anthony Mason, thanks. Researchers are reporting that lead exposure impairs brain development in children even at levels the government now considers safe. A 5-year study found children suffered an intellectual impairment from extremely low amounts of lead in their blood, suggesting there is no safe level. Major League Baseball and the Chicago White Sox are reviewing security rules after a fan attacked an umpire last night. Players broke it up, but officials are concerned because this was the second such incident at Comiskey Park on Chicago's South Side. Last fall, 2 fans attacked a coach for the Kansas City Royals, the same team playing the White Sox last night. Coming up next on the CBS Evening News, up in the sky, it's a bird. On the ground, better duck. Yuck. The warning is on T-shirts and bumper stickers all over the state. Don't mess with Texas. But they're doing it anyway. And as Bob McNamara reports, oh, what a mess.
They are the foul in Fort Worth.
Look at that. Your shoes are nasty and filthy with this. And this over here is just solid bird. Look at that. It's killed the grass.
The noisy, dirty birds are great-tailed grackles.
I'm surprised those wires can stay up with all that added weight.
And like mosquitoes to Minnesota, they're a Texas menace and growing.
It's really difficult to census something that's in the hundreds of thousands, if not millions. For sure we have millions in Texas.
You want to put some money in this meter? I don't think so.
Defiled parking meters, droppings deadly to plants.
It smells so bad, and who's going to want to sit in a restaurant outside and eat next to something like this?
Grackles are federally protected as migratory birds. And with so little that unsettles them, Fort Worth finally drew its guns. Pistols that fire screams into the sky. Shotguns that fire loud blanks. An hour of scare tactics usually sends them away for a few weeks. But the battle scenario is even more intense at Dallas-Fort Worth Airport. The guns and propane cannons last year cut down the number of potentially disastrous bird strikes on aircraft by nearly 30%. In Austin, where their racket echoes nightly through downtown, Janine Romine shoots a laser beam at grackles in the treetops. But high tech has had little success.
They're just really not bothered enough to want to leave the tree.
Great-tailed grackles came out of Mexico and been seen as far north as Nova Scotia. And if Texas has them on the run, they could become a nuisance near you. Bob McNamara, CBS News, Fort Worth.
That's the CBS Evening News. There's a lot more CBS News coming up tonight, beginning with 60 Minutes 2.
First, this American general conquered Baghdad, and now he's got the toughest job in the military. His story tonight on 60 Minutes 2.
Then on 48 Hours Investigates, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. breaks his silence about the murder of Martha Moxley. He says his cousin, Michael Skakel, was wrongfully convicted.
48 Hours Investigates right after 60 Minutes 2 tonight on CBS. For Dan Rather in Baghdad, I'm Harry Smith in New York. I'll see you tomorrow morning on The Early Show. Good night and happy Passover.
For news 24 hours a day, log on to cbsnews.com. The SARS epidemic and the quarantine that didn't work. Tomorrow, experience CBS News.